camera records from Palestine show heavy damage.
Palestinians are growing increasingly impatient.
Israel is at war.
13 Israelis and 260 Palestinians were killed.
Tonight, violence erupting in Jerusalem.
Hopes for peace are fading.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, an unsolvable religious dispute going back thousands of years, pitting terrorism against the civilized world. That's the mental image conjured up by the Middle East for a lot of people. But there's one big problem. It's completely wrong. The conflict is neither ancient, in fact it's less than 100 years old, nor is it rooted in theology, nor is it impossible to resolve. Moreover, the label of terrorism isn't really helpful in understanding the nature of the conflict, as it only serves to artificially create an us versus them narrative, making the conflict entirely one-sided. Let's explore where this crisis began, how it evolved, and imagine how it could potentially be solved. This is Polycrisis. Our story begins at the dawn of the 19th century, when the region we now call Palestine was under the occupation of the Ottoman Empire. The territory was divided into 3 sanjaks, or administrative divisions: the Sanjak of Jerusalem, the Nablus Sanjak, and the Sanjak of Acre. Several Ottoman censuses from 1878 and 1914 reveal the demographic makeup of these 3 regions, with 87% of the population being Muslim, Christians making up 8 to 10%, and Jews accounting for 3 to 5% of the population. They coexisted under the Ottoman system, wherein Muslims held legal and ideological privilege, but Christians and Jews were granted religious and cultural autonomy. In Jerusalem especially, the 3 cultures lived together peacefully, as the populations were roughly of equal size. It wasn't uncommon for an Orthodox Christian to learn the Quran in school, receive Bible teachings at home, and celebrate Christian, Jewish, and Muslim holidays with his neighbors. However, that would all come to a halt. As the 19th century drew to a close, several European nations living under Austro-Hungarian rule wanted their own state. One of the citizens of the Habsburg Empire was Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl. Witnessing the rampant anti-Semitism of his age, especially as it pertained to the Dreyfus affair in France, he concluded that the Jews needed their own state, preferably somewhere away from Europe. Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, with the stated ambition of working towards establishing a national Jewish state in Palestine. Economic hardships, persecution, and Tsarist anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia led many Eastern European Jews to heed Herzl's call. Tens of thousands of them left Europe and settled in Ottoman Palestine, founding several cities. One of these cities was Tel Aviv, so named after Theodor Herzl's novel, whose title translates to The Old New Land. Perhaps surprisingly, the Zionist movement found support in one of the great European powers. Britain was hoping to convince the United States to join the war against the Ottomans by appealing to the American Jewish community, which they perceived to be profoundly influential. As such, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, promising the establishment of a Jewish national state in Palestine. However, prior to this, British diplomats had secured a secret pact with the French, promising to divide the Arab territories amongst themselves once the Ottomans were defeated. France would receive Syria, northern Iraq, and Lebanon, while Britain would get Iraq, Kuwait, and Jordan, with Palestine being put under international control. This came to be known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it plays a major part in the film Lawrence of Arabia.
I've told you, sir, no such treaty exists.
Yes, General, you have lied most bravely, but not convincingly.
Finally, another group of British diplomats had pledged their support to the Emir of Mecca, Sharif Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi. In exchange for leading a revolt against the Ottomans, the British Crown would support his claim to rule an Arab state, which included Palestine. The Emir fulfilled his end of the bargain, but the British had no intention of honoring their promises. Despite having pledged the territory of Palestine to both the Zionists and the tribal powers of Mecca, the British decided to actually keep it for themselves. At the conclusion of the First World War, the newly established League of Nations granted administrative rights over Palestine and Transjordan to the British government. The British mandate for Palestine aimed to keep the people living in the area as divided as possible, in order to prevent the outbreak of revolts. As such, separate institutions were created for Muslims, Jews, and Christians, which made cooperation and even coexistence difficult for the 3 cultures. At first, the British mandate welcomed Jewish immigration, but tensions soon began to arise between the local Palestinian farmers and Jewish settlers. By the 1930s, Jews made up around 30% of the total population. Moreover, as Jewish immigrants purchased larger swathes of land, Arab farmers found themselves increasingly socially marginalized on what they perceived to be their own land. Tensions came to a boiling point in 1936 when Palestinian Arab nationalists revolted against the British administration, demanding Arab independence and the cessation of Jewish immigration. British colonial authorities brutally clamped down on Arab communities, launching manhunts, destroying local political structures, confiscating large caches of weapons from the Arabs, and doling out harsh penalties. In this, they were aided by Jewish paramilitary units, especially the Haganah. Despite significant Jewish assistance in the quelling of the rebellion, the British administration decided to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine at a time where it was most needed, as the horrors of the Holocaust were beginning to reap across Europe. This infuriated the Jewish community, as they felt betrayed by colonial authorities. Furthermore, Britain also demanded that a binational single state be created within a decade, shared by both Jews and Arabs. This solution didn't sit well with either Jewish or Arab communities, and it would prove to be another diplomatic blunder on the side of the colonial rulers of Palestine. Despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, British authorities maintained hope that peaceful coexistence was somehow possible. But this aspiration was ultimately crushed in 1947, when a very young United Nations General Assembly voted to partition Palestine into two separate states, Jewish Israel and Arab Palestine. Jerusalem would become an international zone controlled by the UN. While both nations would receive equal shares of land, the plan effectively turned the region into a jigsaw puzzle, with neither state controlling contiguous territories. Israel seized the opportunity to declare its independence, which led to a series of violent outbreaks between Arabs and Jews. Atrocities, massacres, and acts of urban terrorism were committed by both sides. As a result, the Arab League reacted promptly, and military forces from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon launched an attack into Palestine. The newly formed Israel saw itself surrounded from all sides, and its defeat was imminent. Israel's disaster was prevented when the UN stepped in and brokered a 4-week ceasefire. This ultimately worked in Israel's favor. Ignoring a UN embargo on weapons, Israel heavily imported arms from Czechoslovakia and completely revamped its military. As hostilities resumed, Israel launched a counter-offensive into Arab Palestine, prompting a severe refugee crisis. 700,000 Palestinians were forced to flee their homeland. Today, the descendants of those refugees number around 7 million. In fact, a majority of the 13.7 million Palestinians live in the diaspora, which only exists because of this exodus. This marked the destruction of the Arab community in Palestine, effectively transforming Palestinians into a stateless people. Arab historiography has labeled this period as Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. This also marked the beginning of the Jewish exodus from the Muslim world, as around 900,000 Jews voluntarily left, or were forced to leave Arab countries. Most of them ended up settling in Israel. The Israeli army continued occupying land allocated to the Arabs. Meanwhile, old rivalries and political dissension began flaring up within the Arab League. This internal weakness was exploited by Israel, as it expanded its conquests beyond the borders of Palestine. At the end of the war, Israel stood victorious, having retained the territory allotted to it by the UN, but also being in control of 60% of the territory meant for the Arabs. For the time being, Egypt was left in control of the Gaza Strip, while Jordan occupied the West Bank. Israel would later annex these territories as well during the Six-Day War of 1967, in which the Israeli military soundly defeated a coalition comprised primarily of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, with limited support from other Arab nations. Israel had secured the Golan Heights, formerly under Syrian rule, the West Bank from Jordan, as well as Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel now stood more powerful than ever before. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, a UN Security Council resolution demanded that Israel cede back the territory it had acquired during the war. Obviously, that never came to pass. On the contrary, Israel began a policy of building settlements and encroaching on Palestinian territories, a practice which has been deemed illegal and condemned under international law. The construction by Israel of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory and its associated regime are contrary of international law. The International Court of Justice. Planned house demolitions in the occupied Palestinian territory are illegal. The Red Cross. All settlement activity is illegal under international law, and it erodes the prospects for a lasting peace. The European Union. Israeli settlements amount to a war crime. The United Nations Human Rights Office. Settlement expansion in occupied Palestinian territory violates international law and must cease. The United Nations Security Council. As of the time of this video, there are over 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, with an additional 220,000 Jewish settlers living in Eastern Jerusalem and over 20,000 living in the Golan Heights. For the 7.5 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, life isn't easy. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other humanitarian organizations have repeatedly pointed out the acts of apartheid, forced evictions, demolition of homes, deportations, police abuse, and torture carried out against the Palestinians, as well as other human rights violations committed by the Israeli authorities. Palestinians are effectively regarded as second-class citizens, being subjected to systemic oppression and institutional discrimination, as well as suffering inhumane treatment and being subjected to cruel punishments, including unlawful death sentences. In an attempt to gain some representation for the Palestinian people, the Arab League encouraged the formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, an internationally recognized political coalition. It initially sought the expulsion of all Jews and the establishment of an Arab state in Palestine, but has since shifted positions to only desiring Arab statehood in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The most dominant faction within the PLO is Fatah, a political party founded by Yasser Arafat. There is also another faction that is the de facto governing power in Gaza, namely Hamas, a Sunni Islamist militant organization. Hamas is also responsible for acts of terrorism and violence against both Israeli military personnel and civilians. It has been involved in acts of kidnapping, suicide bombings, rocket attacks, mass murders, and assassination. Hamas even struck up a conflict with Fatah, leading to a Palestinian civil war in 2007. The conflict left casualties on both sides in its wake, as well as an internal rift that hasn't been mended to this day. There have been several attempts at a peace process, including the 1978 Camp David Accords, a series of political agreements between Israel and Egypt, brokered by US President Jimmy Carter. Conspicuously absent from the peace talks were representatives from Palestine, which was condemned by the United Nations. The results were not without controversy, as Egypt was banned from the Arab League for 10 years, and President Sadat was assassinated following what was perceived by many to be a fracture within Arab unity against Israel. As a positive outcome, Egypt regained control of the Sinai Peninsula from Israel. Hostilities between Israel and the Palestinians would also boil over into two intifadas, or Arab uprisings, the first one between 1987 and 1993, and a second one between 2000 and 2005. The first intifada was sparked when an Israeli military truck accidentally crashed into a row of cars, killing and injuring several Palestinians at the Erez checkpoint. Protests rapidly erupted and spread into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Palestinians erected barricades made of garbage, rubble, and burning tires, and began pelting Israeli soldiers with rocks, hurling petrol bombs and other makeshift weapons. Israeli officials responded in force, shooting tear gas and using live ammunition on civilian crowds. Curfews were also imposed, on top of closing down Palestinian schools and cutting entire communities off from water supplies, electricity, and fuel. The Israeli government also instituted a blockade and a ban on the trade of Palestinian goods, shutting down the already brittle Palestinian economy. The escalation of hostilities led to the creation of Hamas, as certain factions from Gaza considered the PLO too secular and too willing to compromise. 1993 also marked the beginning of suicide bombings and other forms of urban terrorism directed against Israel. Hamas found a lot of popular support due to their militant stance, but also because of their social projects, as they built schools, hospitals, and mosques in Gaza. The first intifada ended in 1993 and ultimately left a few hundred Israelis and over 1,000 Palestinians dead in its wake. In the aftermath of the revolt, several rounds of negotiations were held between the PLO and Israel, brokered by US President Bill Clinton, in an attempt to finally find a peaceful resolution to the decades-old conflict. These included the Oslo Accords as part of the larger Oslo peace process, the 2000 Camp David Summit, and the Clinton parameters. All of these failed spectacularly on the basis of mutual mistrust and accusations of violations. Extremists on both sides boycotted the peace talks, and the Oslo Accords even led to the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
Israel, a nation in shock, grieves for its murdered leader Yitzhak Rabin.
On the ground, peace was nowhere in sight, as in 2000 opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a provocative visit to the Al-Aqsa compound on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, under military protection, sparking the Second Intifada. This uprising was far more violent than the first, with over 1,000 Israelis and more than 3,000 Palestinians killed. Israel's policy towards Palestine shifted more towards the far right, along with public opinion. A wall of separation was erected around the West Bank, and checkpoints were set in place to control the movement of Palestinians. In 2005, Israel withdrew its troops from Gaza as the militant group Hamas won the legislative elections. With the moderate Fatah party in control of the West Bank and the more radical Hamas ruling over Gaza, the rift between the two factions widened. As Hamas's grip over Gaza tightened, Israel imposed an indefinite blockade on the overpopulated small Palestinian territory, further deepening the humanitarian crisis. Most of the more than 2 million Gazans live in refugee camps and rely on UN aid. On the other hand, the West Bank is effectively under martial law imposed by Israeli authorities, with several international human rights groups deeming Israel's administration as apartheid. In retaliation for the abuses committed against the Palestinian people during the last decade, Hamas has launched several rockets into Israeli territories, as well as conducting kidnappings, suicide bombings, and other acts of terrorism. The Israel Defense Forces have usually responded with violent incursions into Palestinian territories, also directed against the civilian population. Meanwhile, Israel has continued its policy of establishing illegal settlements on the West Bank, further encroaching on Palestinian territories, in an attempt to overwhelm and expel Palestinians from the land they currently inhabit. As a conclusion, the Israeli-Palestine conflict is not thousands of years old, but rather it started less than 80 years ago. While religious differences do exist, they certainly don't play a decisive role in the conflict, as the entire dispute is mostly about land and territorial control. Finally, the issue can't be simply boiled down to terrorism versus the civilized world, as that would be a reductionist oversimplification that is only partially true. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a complex geopolitical topic that cannot simply be addressed as an issue of us versus them, nor can it be explained in simple black and white terms. We hope this video has shed some light on this delicate topic. What is your stance on the conflict? Let us know in the comments below. And if you would like to see more videos on world issues and geopolitics, leave a like, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification icon. This is Polycrisis.